Welcome back, my darlings. It's Ava. Get comfortable, and let's talk about cages. Not the iron ones, but the golden ones. The ones made of $3 million chandeliers, designer gowns, and the suffocating expectations of the men who claim to love us. I've seen countless marriages crumble because a woman quietly arranged herself into a box to please a man dying a little more every day. But today's story, it's about a man who had to watch his wife literally die to realize he was the warden. Let's dive into this delicious, ruthless tale of a billionaire who travels back in time not to be a better husband, but to blow up the cage entirely. Here are 3 moments where this story absolutely had me by the throat. The last words Dr. Eleanor Vance ever spoke to her husband were not, "I love you." They weren't instructions for her funeral, nor were they a desperate plea for him to save her. As the deafening wail of ambulance sirens pierced the suffocating darkness of the collapsed tunnel, Ellie looked at Richard with a chilling, absolute clarity. "If there is a next life," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screeching of twisting metal. "I want to be a scientist again, no more arranged marriages." Then her hand simply slipped from his grasp. Richard Sterling, the ruthless, untouchable CEO of the Sterling Group, could only watch in paralyzed horror. He was pinned beneath the crushed dashboard of his wrecked Aston Martin, 2 broken ribs piercing his lungs. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the sudden, gaping void in his chest. Blood pooled over the face of Ellie's watch. A custom Patek Philippe their parents had gifted them on their wedding day 3 years ago. It was covered in microscopic scratches. He had never noticed that before. He had never noticed how she stared out the passenger window, tracing invisible molecular structures against the glass. He had never noticed that the brilliant MIT biochemist he had married had been slowly dying of suffocation inside his Fifth Avenue penthouse long before this car crash. For 3 years, she had woken up at dawn to execute a flawless, high society makeup routine, just to sit across from him at the breakfast table for 10 minutes before he rushed off to Wall Street. She had traded her lab coat and crisper research for charity galas and lonely midnights waiting with a warm cup of tea. He had never asked her if she was happy. He just assumed she was. "Richard, my lab coat is still in my old locker," she had murmured deliriously, just moments before, her forehead bleeding heavily. "I left it behind." She had never let it go. Her entire life with him had been a cage. She didn't want him in her next life. She didn't even factor him into her eternity. As Richard's vision faded to black, the long, piercing tone of the heart monitor echoed in his ears. It wasn't hers, it was his. "If I could just have one more chance," Richard thought as the darkness swallowed him whole. "I would tear that cage apart with my bare hands." Richard gasped, his lungs inflating with a violent, desperate heave. He expected the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating scent of gasoline. Instead, his senses were assaulted by the overwhelming fragrance of 10,000 white roses and the expensive, heavy perfume of New York's elite. He blinked against a blinding light. He wasn't in a crushed car. He was standing under a $3 million baccarat crystal chandelier. "Richard, focus, the Archbishop is waiting," a sharp, low voice hissed near his ear. Richard turned his head sharply. Standing beside him in a pristine tuxedo was his father, Elias Sterling. The man's hair was still dark, his posture straight and formidable, not the frail, stroke-ridden old man he had become 3 years later. Richard looked down at his own hands. There was no blood. He was wearing a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, a white Butoni Fera pinned perfectly to his lapel. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb trembling as he hit the power button. May 18th, 3 years ago. He was standing at the altar of the grand ballroom in the Plaza Hotel. It was his wedding day. He had come back. A heavy silence fell over the cavernous room as the wedding march reached its crescendo. The heavy oak doors at the end of the aisle swung open. There she was. Ellie Vance stood at the edge of the white runner, looking exactly as she had in his memory. She wore a flawless, trailing white gown, her hair swept up into an elegant chignon. To the hundreds of billionaires, politicians, and socialites in the room, she looked like the perfect, obedient bride, the ultimate bargaining chip to merge Vance Pharmaceuticals with Sterling Capital. But Richard, looking at her with the eyes of a man who had watched her die, saw the truth. He saw the rigid, unnatural way she held her spine. He saw how tightly her fingers gripped her bouquet, her knuckles stark white against the stems. As she began her slow walk down the aisle, he noticed the slight hesitation in her steps. She wasn't used to those towering stilettos. She was used to Converse sneakers and the sterile floors of a laboratory. When she finally reached the altar, her father, Arthur Vance, placed her hand into Richard's. Her fingertips were freezing. Richard's breath hitched. It was the exact same icy temperature he had felt when her hand slipped from his in the wreckage. She wasn't nervous about the wedding. She was in mourning. She was attending the funeral of her own dreams. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom, "we are gathered here today to join Richard Elias Sterling and Eleanor Grace Vance in holy matrimony." Ellie stared straight ahead. Her expression was a masterclass in polite neutrality. She was ready to say the words. She was ready to sign her life away because her father had tripped her into it, using her late mother's wishes and the family's financial future as leverage. If there is a next life, no more arranged marriages. Her dying voice echoed in Richard's mind, louder than the Archbishop, louder than the pounding of his own heart. If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The Archbishop intoned, a mere formality. "Stop! Oh, ladies, let's pause right here. We've all seen men apologize with Cartier or hollow promises of, 'I'll do better.' But how many will torch $1 billion merger and their own reputation to save you from themselves?" Richard didn't try to be a kinderwarden in her second life. He blew the whole damn cage to pieces. He willingly took the villain edit in the press, so Ellie could have her freedom. That's not just big CEO energy. That's a man who finally learned that true love isn't about possession or optics. It's about liberation. Stop. The word didn't just leave Richard's lips. It commanded the room. The Archbishop froze. The organist missed a key, producing a jarring, discordant note. A collective gasp rippled through the 300 guests. Ellie's head snapped up. For the first time, the polite mask slipped, revealing genuine shock in her wide, intelligent eyes. "Richard, what the hell are you doing?" Elias Sterling hissed from behind him, his voice venomous. Stepping forward to grip his son's shoulder, read the room. Richard ignored him. He didn't look at the whispering crowd, nor did he look at Arthur Vance, whose face was rapidly turning an alarming shade of purple. He kept his eyes entirely on Ellie. "There will be no wedding today," Richard announced, his voice steady, carrying clearly to the back of the room. "This marriage is off." Pandemonium erupted. Wall Street titans immediately reached for their phones, already calculating the devastating blow this would deal to both families' stock prices on Monday morning. Arthur Vance marched toward the altar, his hands balled into fists. Elias's grip on Richard's shoulder became a painful claw. "Are you out of your mind?" Elias snarled, abandoning all pretense of decorum. "Do you know what you are throwing away? The Vance patents." "I don't care about the patents, and I don't care about the optics." Richard cut his father off, his tone so violently cold that Elias actually took a step back. Richard turned his full attention back to the bride, amidst the screaming families, the flashing cameras of the society press, and the utter destruction of a billion-dollar merger. Ellie stood perfectly still. She didn't cry. She didn't scream at him for humiliating her. Instead, Richard watched her chest rise and fall in one long, trembling breath. He watched her shoulders, which had been tight with tension for months, suddenly drop. He caught the micro-expression that flashed across her face, gone in a fraction of a second, but unmistakable to a man who had lived a lifetime with her. Relief, a profound, soul-deep relief. Arthur Vance reached the altar, shoving past the Archbishop. "Sterling, what is the meaning of this? You dare humiliate my daughter in front of—" "I am not humiliating her, Arthur," Richard said, his voice slicing through the noise like a scalpel. He stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Ellie and her furious father, shielding her from the crowd. Richard looked down at the woman who had died in his arms. He saw the confusion swirling in her eyes, mixed with a cautious, desperate hope. "Dr. Vance," Richard said softly, using her academic title deliberately, ignoring the chaos exploding behind him. "You have somewhere else to be." The fallout was instantaneous, brutal, and exactly what Richard had anticipated. By 9 a.m. on Monday, Sterling Group's stock had tumbled 3%. The financial news networks were having a field day, plastering Richard's face across every screen with Chiron's reading, cold feet, or corporate warfare. Sterling CEO abandons Vance heiress at the altar. Inside the glass, walled penthouse office of Sterling Tower. Elias Sterling hurled a crystal tumbler against the wall. It shattered, raining expensive scotch and glass over the Persian rug. 3%, Richard, Elias roared, his face flushed with a dangerous hypertensive red. Billions of dollars in market cap wiped out because you decided to have a psychological breakdown in front of the Archbishop. Do you have any idea what Vance Pharma's FDA connections meant to our medical division? Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression entirely unreadable. He looked at his father, vibrant, terrifying, and completely unaware of the massive stroke that would confine him to a wheelchair in exactly 36 months. "I know exactly what they meant, Dad," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Nothing. Vance Pharma's pipeline is dry. They haven't had a truly innovative patent in a decade. Merging with them for their distribution channels is like buying a sinking ship just for the lifeboats." Elias slammed his hands onto Richard's desk, leaning in. "Then what was the point of the last 6 months of negotiations? What about the girl? Arthur Vance is threatening to pull every joint venture we have." "Let him," Richard replied, standing up. He adjusted his cuffs, his movements precise and unbothered. "Vance needs our capital, far more than we need his outdated infrastructure. I'll handle Arthur." "And how exactly are you going to explain humiliating his daughter?" Richard paused at the door. He didn't humiliate her. He had taken the entire brunt of the media's assassination. The press was calling him a ruthless commitment. Phobic bastard. Ellie was being painted as the tragic, blameless victim. That was exactly how he had designed it. "I'm going to make him an offer," Richard said softly. "One he won't be able to refuse." The Vance estate in Connecticut was a sprawling old money fortress of stone and manicured ivy. When Richard was escorted into the mahogany, panelled study, Arthur Vance was standing by the window, a cigar unlit in his hand. The patriarch of the Vance family looked less like a grieving father and more like a CEO who had just lost a hostile takeover. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here, Sterling," Arthur growled, not turning around. "My board is in a panic. My daughter's reputation is a punchline on page 6. You treated my family like garbage. I apologize for the theatrics, Arthur, Richard said, taking a seat without being offered one. But the marriage was a mistake for both of us. Arthur spun around, his eyes narrowing. A mistake. You vetted her for months. She's gorgeous. She has the Vance name. And she's a goddamn NT doctorate. What more did you want? You think you can just walk away and not pay the price? I am paying the price, Richard countered smoothly. I'm taking all the PR damage, and as for the business, I am still prepared to inject the $50 million into Vance Pharma's manufacturing division, just as we discussed. Arthur froze. The hostility drained from his face, replaced by extreme calculating suspicion. In the world of Wall Street, nobody gave away $50 million out of guilt. Without the marriage? Arthur asked slowly. What's the catch? No catch, Richard said, leaning back, his gaze turning razor sharp. I want absolutely nothing from Vance Pharma. I just want one thing from you. Name it. Let Ellie go back to the lab. The silence in the study was so absolute that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like gunshots. Arthur stared at Richard as if he had grown a second head. What? You heard me, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. She's a biochemist, Arthur. She specializes in CRISPR gene editing. She doesn't belong at charity galas, and she certainly doesn't belong trapped in a Fifth Avenue penthouse, playing the perfect corporate wife. Let her go back to Massachusetts. Let her do her research, Arthur scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. That's ridiculous. She's a Vance. Her mother, God rest her soul, made me promise on her deathbed that I would see Ellie securely settled with a strong family. Her little science projects were fine for college, but she needs a real future. A husband isn't a future, Arthur, Richard said, his tone laced with a sudden, icy venom that made the older man flinch. A microscope is. Thud. The sound of a heavy object hitting the hardwood floor echoed from the doorway. Richard turned. Standing in the threshold of the study was Ellie. She was no longer the porcelain doll in the $3 million wedding gown. She wore a faded white t-shirt, worn in Levi's, and a pair of scuffed Converse sneakers. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy, utilitarian ponytail, completely free of makeup. This was the real Dr. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had died in his passenger seat. At her feet lay her smartphone, its screen cracked from the fall. She didn't look at it. Her wide, intelligent eyes were fixed entirely on Richard. There was a storm of emotions warring on her face, confusion, disbelief. But beneath it all, Richard saw the violent tremor of a paradigm shifting. For her entire life, men had looked at her and seen a Vance. They had seen a trust fund, a pretty face, a strategic alliance. What did you just say? Ellie's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Arthur stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. Ellie, go back upstairs. Richard and I are discussing business, I said. Richard interrupted, standing up and holding Ellie's gaze. That you shouldn't be a housewife. You should be a scientist. Ellie stopped breathing. She stood frozen in the doorway, the sunlight from the hallway catching the sudden, glassy sheen of tears in her eyes. But she didn't cry. Her jaw clenched tight, her chin trembling slightly, as she fought to suppress a wave of emotion, so massive it threatened to drown her. For 10 agonizing seconds, she just stared at the man who had ruined her wedding, and simultaneously handed her back her soul. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath, bent down to pick up her cracked phone, and turned on her heel. She walked away without a single word. But Richard noticed her posture. Her spine was ramrod straight. She wasn't walking like a disgraced bride. She was walking like a woman who had just remembered who she was. 2 days later, Richard sat in his office, reviewing a stack of dossiers his headhunter had compiled. He had ordered a search for the top CRISPR researchers in the country. He had read through papers from Harvard, Stanford, and Johns Hopkins, but the name at the very top of his list was the only one that mattered. Dr. Eleanor Vance, lead author, Nature Biotechnology, focus, miniaturization of CRISPR, CARS 12F systems. Her former MIT advisor had written a note in her file. Ellie is the most gifted geneticist of her generation. It is a tragedy to the scientific community that she left the field. Richard traced the printed words with his thumb. Not anymore, he thought. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in this timeline yet. It rang 3 times before she picked up. Hello. Her voice was guarded, laced with a heavy dose of suspicion. Dr. Vance, it's Richard Sterling. A long beat of silence. I know. I have caller ID. What do you want, Richard? I want to hire you. Another silence. This one heavier, thicker. Is this a joke? You publicly humiliated me at the altar less than a week ago. And now you're calling to offer me a job. I'm not offering you a job, Richard said, swiveling his chair to look out over the Manhattan skyline. I'm offering you an empire. Sterling Medical is building a new, independent gene editing laboratory. I need a principal investigator. And you chose me. Why? Pity, guilt. Her voice turned sharp, defensive. I don't want your charity, Richard. I don't do charity. Richard fired back, his voice dropping into the ruthless cadence of a Wall Street predator. Your thesis solved the off-target bottleneck of the Cas12F system. Your delivery efficiency is 3 times higher than the industry standard. I spent 3 days looking at every geneticist in this country, and you are the best. He heard her breath catch. You read my papers. Every single one, Richard said softly. He could hear the faint sound of a shaky exhale through the speaker. When she finally spoke, the defensive armor in her voice had completely melted away, leaving something incredibly raw. You are the first man in my entire life, Ellie whispered, her voice cracking, who didn't call me just because I am Arthur Vance's daughter. Richard's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. So, do we have a deal? I have conditions, she said, her scientific pragmatism instantly kicking back in. Name them. I have total autonomy over the research direction. No corporate interference. No nepo, babies in my lab. And I want the exact same salary as any other pie. No special treatment, just because of our history. Done. You agreed too fast, she noted, a hint of genuine amusement bleeding into her tone. Are you sure you know what you are getting into, Richard? I'm sure. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. Oh, and one more thing, Dr. Vance. What? The dress code is casual. Wear your Converse. The line went dead quiet, and then, for the first time since he had known her across 2 lifetimes, Richard heard her laugh. It wasn't polite. It wasn't trained. It was real. I'll see you Monday, Mr. Sterling. Richard hung up the phone. The game was set. But what neither of them knew was that the moment her name was attached to the Sterling lab, a shadow in the Vance family had already begun to move against her. And Richard was about to find out just how far her family would go to destroy her. Sterling Tower was a monument to Wall Street conservatism. Its lobby was paved in cold, imported Italian marble. Its executives wore bespoke Brioni suits, spoke in hushed, aggressive tones, and viewed anyone without a Wharton MBA as a subordinate species. When Dr. Eleanor Vance, stepped out of the private elevator onto the 40th floor. The entire executive wing seemed to hold its collective breath. She wasn't wearing Prada. She wasn't carrying a Birkin bag. She wore a faded pair of black Converse high tops, dark denim, and a crisp, blindingly white lab coat with her mighty credentials clipped to the breast pocket. Her hair was tied back in a severe, no-nonsense ponytail. She looked entirely out of place in the billionaire's fortress. And yet, as Richard watched her walk toward him, he thought she had never looked more like a queen taking her throne. "You are staring, Mr. Sterling," Ellie noted, stopping in front of him. Her tone was brisk, professional, but the slight upward tilt of her chin betrayed a flicker of amusement. "Just admiring the footwear," Richard said smoothly, his hands resting in the pockets of his tailored trousers. "Follow me, Dr. Vance. Let me show you your new kingdom." He led her past the glass-walled conference rooms, ignoring the blatant stares of his senior vice presidents. He swiped his black keycard at a set of reinforced frosted glass double doors at the end of the corridor. The doors hissed open, revealing a sprawling 12,000 square foot laboratory. It was a masterpiece of modern biotechnology. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Manhattan skyline, bathing the spotless stainless steel workbenches in natural light. Biosafety cabinets, ultra-low-temperature freezers, and a state-of-the-art flow cytometer lined the walls. In the center of the room sat the crown jewel, a next-generation Illumina NovaSeq sequencer, an $8 million piece of machinery that most universities had to share among 50 researchers. Ellie stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't speak. She walked slowly toward the sequencer, her Converse squeaking softly against the pristine epoxy floor. She reached out, her fingertips hovering just a millimeter above the machine's sleek casing, as if she were afraid it was a mirage that would vanish if she touched it. Richard stood by the door, watching her. In his past life, he had bought her a $3 million diamond necklace for their first anniversary. She had smiled politely, thanked him, and locked it in a safe, never to be worn. Now, looking at a piece of heavy machinery, her eyes were shining with an intensity that took his breath away. $50 million, Ellie whispered, finally turning to look at him. Her voice was unsteady. "You spent $50 million to build a turnkey CRISPR lab in less than a month." "I told you I wanted the best," Richard replied evenly. "The equipment is yours. The budget is yours. You answer to no one but me." Ellie swallowed hard. She looked around the empty, gleaming lab and then back at Richard. "Why are you really doing this? You could have bought a biotech startup for a fraction of this cost. You blew up a wedding, alienated my father, and spent a fortune, just to put me in a lab." Richard held her gaze. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her about the blood on the steering wheel, or the way her pulse had faded under his fingertips. "Because you don't belong in a cage, Ellie," he said softly. "You belong here." A single tear spilled over her lower lash line. She furiously wiped it away with the back of her hand, clearing her throat. "Capitalist," she muttered, though a watery smile broke through. "Don't expect me to thank you. I am going to make you work for every penny. I am counting on it. Get to work, Doctor." While Ellie booted up the servers in her sanctuary, a very different scene was unfolding 3 floors down. The boardroom of Sterling Medical was thick with tension. Marcus Thorne, the 50-year-old vice president of R&D, paced angrily in front of the mahogany table, addressing a room of senior executives. "It's a PR nightmare and a financial liability," Marcus spat, slapping a folder onto the table. "She has 0 industry experience. She's an academic who hasn't published in a year. And let's not ignore the elephant in the room. She is the runaway bride. Richard humiliated her family, and now he's giving her a $50 million sandbox to play in. It reeks of nepotism and guilt. Are you quite finished, Marcus? The temperature in the room plummeted. Richard stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed, but his dark eyes radiating a lethal, predatory calm. He walked slowly to the head of the table. The executives scrambled to sit up straight, the blood draining from their faces. Marcus puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his bravado. Richard, be reasonable. The board is questioning this. We have seasoned pharmacologists who have been waiting years for this kind of funding, giving it to Avance. Do you know the quality control metrics for a CRISPR? K's 12F viral packaging protocol, Marcus? Richard interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. Marcus blinked, derailed. What? No, but that's not the point. Do you know how to minimize off-target cleavage in a full genome screen? Richard took a step closer. Richard, I am a manager, not a bench scientist. You are obsolete, Richard stated, the word dropping like an anvil. He leaned over the table, bracing his hands on the polished wood, forcing Marcus to shrink back. Sterling Medical has spent the last 10 years churning out generic copycats and me, 2 drugs. You haven't had an original thought since the Obama administration. Marcus's face turned a mottled, ugly shade of red, his jaw working silently. Dr. Vance's doctoral thesis solved a delivery bottleneck that Pfizer and Moderna are still struggling with, Richard continued, his gaze sweeping the terrified room. She isn't here because of my guilt. She is here because she is going to secure the next decade of our market share. Richard stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket. Let me make this absolutely clear. Dr. Vance is off limits. If I hear one whisper of gossip, one complaint about her credentials, or one comment about her personal life, you won't just be fired. I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every pharmaceutical company on the Eastern Seaboard. Do we understand each other? The silence was absolute. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Understood, Richard. Good. Get back to work. It was 11:30 p.m. when Richard finally finished reviewing the quarterly reports. The executive floors were completely dark, save for the faint, sterile glow emanating from the glass doors of the new lab. He walked quietly down the corridor, intending to tell Ellie to go home. In his past life, she would have been asleep on the sofa by now, a cold cup of tea on the table beside her. As he approached the glass doors, he stopped. Ellie was sitting at the primary workstation, her eyes glued to a dual monitor setup, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She was completely absorbed, a half-eaten protein bar resting on a napkin beside her. She looked exhausted, brilliant, and utterly alive. But Richard's eyes narrowed, his predator instincts instantly flaring. Ellie wasn't alone, standing a few feet behind her, pretending to clean a set of beakers, was a junior lab technician. Richard remembered approving the hire, a kid named Liam, fresh out of Columbia, hired to handle the grunt work. But Liam wasn't looking at the beakers. His eyes were locked onto Ellie's keyboard, tracking the exact keystrokes she was using to enter the encryption passcode for the primary server. Richard stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, his blood turning to ice. Arthur Vance wasn't the real threat. It was Victor Vance, Ellie's ambitious, cutthroat cousin, who currently sat on the board of a rival biotech firm. Victor had always been terrified of Ellie's genius overshadowing him. The Vance family wasn't just going to let her succeed. They had already planted a rat in her sanctuary. Richard pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. His eyes never left the junior technician. You want to play dirty Victor, Richard thought. a dark, ruthless smile curling his lips. "Let me show you how a monster plays the game." Richard didn't storm into the lab. He didn't confront Liam the technician in the ruthless ecosystem of Wall Street. You didn't kill the rat the moment you spotted it. You followed the rat to find the nest. He tapped out a brief encrypted message to his head of corporate security, full background check on Liam Davies. Track all his outbound communications. Do not alert him. Slipping his phone back into his pocket, Richard smoothed his expression into one of mild CEO-level exhaustion and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the lab. The soft hum of the ventilation system masked his footsteps until he was right behind her. "Is that protein bar supposed to be dinner, Dr. Vance?" Ellie jumped, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. She spun around in her ergonomic chair, her eyes wide behind a pair of blue light, blocking glasses. "Jesus, Richard," she breathed, exhaling sharply. "Are you trying to give me a myocardial infarction?" "Just checking on my $50 million investment," he replied smoothly. He glanced over her shoulder at the monitors, which were filled with cascading rows of genomic sequences. "It is midnight. The building is empty." "Science doesn't sleep," Ellie said, turning back to her screens. She tapped a few keys, saving her progress. "I am running the first batch of guide RNAs through the simulation. If this target algorithm holds, we can bypass the initial high-throughput screening phase entirely. It cuts our timeline by 6 months." Richard listened to her speak, entirely mesmerized. In his past life, the only things she had ever discussed with him were the guest lists for charity galas, and whether the caterers should serve sea bass or filet mignon. Now, her voice was rapid, animated, and crackling with intellectual electricity. "You need to eat," Richard said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A real meal, not sawdust wrapped in foil." "I don't have time to go out," she protested, gesturing to the sequencer. "The run finishes in 40 minutes. Then I'll bring it to you." Before she could object, Richard turned and walked out of the lab. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying a large, unmarked brown paper bag that smelled distinctly of spices and roasted chilies. He walked past Liam, who was hastily wiping down a perfectly clean centrifuge, and set the bag down on the small break-room table adjacent to Ellie's workstation. "Szechuan," Richard announced, pulling out white cartons. "Mapo tofu, dry-fried green beans, and water. Boiled beef, extra spicy." Ellie stopped typing. She slowly took off her glasses and stared at the food, then up at Richard. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice suddenly very quiet. Richard froze. In their past life, he had discovered her love for spicy food entirely by accident. 3 years into their marriage, he had come home early and caught her eating leftover, eye-watering spicy takeout over the kitchen sink, hiding it from the private chef who only prepared bland, high, society French cuisine for her delicate palate. "Let me tell you a secret. Real intimacy isn't built over a $500 sea base at La Bernardine. It's built over sweating through Szechuan takeout at midnight in your oldest sneakers." In his past life, Richard bought her diamonds she locked in a safe. Now he brings her Mapo tofu because he knows the real Ellie, the messy, brilliant, sleep-deprived scientist, not the polished Fifth Avenue porcelain doll. When a man stops treating you like a museum exhibit and starts feeding your actual soul and your stomach, you hold on to him. He couldn't tell her that. "Lucky guess," Richard lied smoothly, pulling up a stool opposite her. "You spent 5 years in Boston. MIT grad students survive on cheap, spicy takeout." Ellie eyed him suspiciously for a moment, but the aroma was too much to resist. She grabbed a pair of chopsticks and dug into the beef. The moment the chili oil hit her tongue, her eyes closed in pure, unadulterated bliss. Oh my God, she groaned softly. I haven't had this since I left Cambridge. Richard watched her eat, a painful knot tightening in his chest. She had sacrificed so much for a family that viewed her as nothing more than an asset. She had even sacrificed her own tastes, her own comfort, to fit into a mold that had ultimately killed her. Not this time, he vowed silently. Eat whatever you want. Be whoever you want. You are not eating, Ellie noted. Her lips slightly red from the spice. She pointed her chopsticks at him. Don't tell me the great Richard Sterling is afraid of a little chili oil. I prefer to keep my stomach lining intact for board meetings, he deflected. Though he picked up a pair of chopsticks just to humor her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The only sounds the hum of the servers and the clinking of chopsticks against the cartons. It was the most domestic, intimate moment they had ever shared, eating takeout in a sterile lab at midnight, entirely stripped of the pretense of their social classes. Richard, Ellie said suddenly, her tone shifting from playful to serious. She put her chopsticks down and looked at him. Why did you do it? Do what? The wedding! She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. I know you told my father. It was a bad business deal. I know you told your board I was a strategic hire. But I saw your face at the altar. Richard's hand stilled. You looked, she hesitated, searching for the right word. You looked terrified, not of marrying me, but like you were looking at a ghost, like you knew something terrible was going to happen. If you said, I do. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. She was too smart. She was a scientist. She observed data, anomalies, micro-expressions. She had seen the raw panic of a man who had just watched her die. I realized, Richard said slowly, choosing his words with surgical precision, that if I put that ring on your finger, I would be destroying a brilliant mind. I realized that the cage my family and your family built for you would eventually kill you. He wasn't lying. Not really. Ellie stared at him, her dark eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Slowly, the tension left her shoulders. My cousin Victor called me today, she said quietly, dropping a bomb that made Richard's blood run cold. What did he want? Richard asked, his voice deliberately neutral. He offered me a job at his firm. Told me that Sterling Medical was a sinking ship and that you were just using me to get back at my father. Ellie let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He said if I didn't come work for him, he would make sure I was blacklisted from every major journal in the country. Richard's jaw clenched so hard, his teeth ached. Victor Vance, the golden boy of the Vance family, who had always been deeply threatened by Ellie's intellect. And what did you tell him? Ellie looked Richard dead in the eye. I told him to go to hell. I told him I have $50 million of your money to spend, and I intend to crush his R&D pipeline within a year. A slow, predatory smile spread across Richard's face. God, she was magnificent. Good, Richard said softly. But Ellie, Victor isn't just going to accept no for an answer. He plays dirty. I know, she said, waving a hand dismissively. He's always been a snake, but he's not a scientist. He doesn't understand the data. I am not worried about him. But I am, Richard thought, his eyes flicking subtly toward the lab floor, where Liam the technician was still pretending to reorganize a supply closet. Finish your food, Doctor, Richard said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. I'll let you get back to your simulation, but from now on, you don't leave this building alone after dark. My driver will take you home. Ellie opened her mouth to argue, but the absolute finality in his tone stopped her. Fine, she muttered. Bossy. Good night, Ellie. Good night, Richard. As Richard walked out of the lab, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his head of security. Background check on Liam Davies complete. Found a shell company depositing $10,000 a month into his offshore account. The shell company traces back to Victor Vance. Richard's eyes darkened, turning as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic in winter. The rat had a nest. It was time to burn it down. The trap was set with the kind of meticulous, chilling precision that had made Richard Sterling the most feared CEO on Wall Street. He didn't fire Liam Davies. He didn't lock him out of the building to catch a corporate spy. You had to give them something worth stealing, and then watch them hang themselves with it. For 3 days, Ellie had been working on a highly sensitive algorithmic model for a new lung cancer target, internally codenamed TGT-17. It was the holy grail of her CRISPR research. If the model proved accurate, it would bypass years of traditional clinical trials. Richard knew Victor Vance was desperate for a win. Vance Pharma's oncology pipeline was drying up, and Victor's seat on the board was looking increasingly precarious. He needed a miracle. He needed Ellie's data. On Thursday evening, Richard walked into the lab. Ellie was at the whiteboard, furiously scribbling molecular pathways. "Dr. Vance," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. Liam was nearby, pretending to calibrate a pipette. "I need you in the boardroom for a budget review, now." Ellie paused, marker in hand, frowning. "Richard, I'm in the middle of a cascade mapping. Can't this wait?" "No," Richard said sharply. "Bring your tablet. We're going to be a while." Ellie sighed, capping the marker with an annoyed click. "Fine. Capitalists," she muttered under her breath, grabbing her tablet and following him out the glass doors. The moment the heavy doors hissed shut behind them, the lab was dead silent. From the security control room on the 42nd floor, Richard and his head of security, a hulking ex-Marine named Miller, watched the live feed from the lab's hidden cameras. Ellie stood beside Richard, her arms crossed, looking thoroughly confused. "Why are we in the security room, Richard?" she asked, her annoyance fading into apprehension. "What is going on?" "Watch," Richard said softly, pointing to the main monitor. On the screen, Liam Davies waited exactly 2 minutes. Then, moving with practiced urgency, he abandoned his pipettes and walked straight to Ellie's primary workstation. He pulled a small black USB drive from his pocket and inserted it into the tower. Ellie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "He's downloading the TGT-17 file." "Richard, stop him. That's months of work." "Let him," Richard said, his voice ice. "Cold, he's not downloading your actual algorithm, Ellie. He's downloading a honeypot file. My cybersecurity team planted this morning. It looks exactly like your data, but it's entirely fabricated. It's useless." Ellie stared at the screen, her shock morphing into a cold, hard fury. "Who is paying him?" "Your cousin," Richard replied. "Victor!" Ellie closed her eyes, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips. Of course it's Victor. He couldn't beat me in the lab, so he tries to steal from me." She opened her eyes, looking at Richard. "What do we do now? Call the police?" "No," Richard said, his eyes fixed on the screen as Liam pocketed the USB drive and hurried out of the lab. "The police will just arrest Liam. Victor will claim he knows nothing about it, hire a top-tier lawyer for the kid, and walk away clean. If we want to stop Victor, we have to destroy his leverage." "How?" Richard turned to her, a predatory glint in his dark eyes. "We let him present the data to his board." 2 days later, Victor Vance stood at the head of the mahogany table in the Vance Pharma boardroom, projecting an air of supreme confidence. "Gentlemen," Victor said smoothly, clicking his laser pointer at the projection screen, "I present to you the future of our oncology division, a revolutionary CRISPR target that will make our competitors obsolete. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, looking cautiously optimistic. This is impressive, Victor. Where did this data come from? Our R&D team hasn't reported anything this advanced. I have my sources, Uncle Arthur, Victor said with a smug smile. Let's just say I've acquired proprietary data that puts us years ahead of Sterling Medical. Before Arthur could ask another question, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The room fell dead silent. Richard Sterling walked in, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, looking like a grim reaper of corporate finance. And right beside him, wearing her white lab coat and Converse, was Dr. Eleanor Vance. "What the hell is this?" Victor demanded, his face draining of color. "Security! How did they get in here?" "I own 30% of the building's management company, Victor," Richard said casually, pulling out a chair for Ellie. "I can walk in wherever I please." Arthur Vance stood up, his face a mask of fury. "Richard, Ellie, what is the meaning of this interruption?" "We're here to save you from committing corporate suicide, Arthur," Richard said, leaning his hands on the table. He looked at the projection screen, then at Victor. "That's a fascinating presentation. Victor TGT, -17, brilliant target." Victor swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "It's proprietary Vance Pharma research. It's garbage," Ellie interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative. She walked to the front of the room, standing right next to her cousin. She didn't look intimidated. She looked like a scientist inspecting a particularly disappointing specimen. "The data you are presenting to your board, Victor, is a fabricated honeypot file," Ellie said, her eyes sweeping the room of stunned executives. "The molecular pathways are intentionally inverted. The binding affinities are statistically impossible. If you actually tried to synthesize a drug based on this data, it wouldn't just fail clinical trials, it would be highly toxic." The boardroom erupted into chaos. "Is this true, Victor?" Arthur bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. Victor was hyperventilating, his eyes darting toward the exit. "She's lying! She's just trying to protect her own." Richard pulled a sleek black folder from his jacket and tossed it onto the table. It slid perfectly to a stop in front of Arthur. "Those are the wire transfer records from a shell company controlled by Victor, paying a junior technician in my lab $10,000 a month to steal Dr. Vance's research," Richard stated, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Corporate espionage, a federal crime." Arthur stared at the documents, his face turning ashen. "You didn't just try to steal from Sterling Medical, Victor," Richard continued, his tone lethal. "You tried to steal from her, and you were too stupid to realize you were stealing poison." Richard turned to the board members, who were watching the scene in horrified silence. "If Vance Pharma proceeds with any research based on this stolen data, Sterling Medical will file a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit that will bankrupt this company before the end of the fiscal year." Richard announced. He looked directly at Arthur. "Remove him from the board, Arthur, today, or I will bury you all." Without waiting for a response, Richard turned to Ellie. "Dr. Vance, we're done here." Ellie looked at her cousin, who was now slumped in his chair, his career entirely destroyed in the span of 5 minutes. She felt no pity. She felt nothing but the clean, sharp edge of justice. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, Richard right beside her. As the elevator doors closed, sealing them off from the screaming match erupting in the boardroom, Ellie let out a long, shaky breath. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving her hands trembling slightly. Richard noticed. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and gently wrapped his large, warm hand over hers, steadying her. Ellie looked up at him, her heart doing a strange, sudden flip. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew the data was fake because you had your cyber team build it. I told you," Richard said softly, his thumb brushing lightly against her knuckles. "I protect my investments." But as he looked down at her, Ellie saw something in his eyes that had absolutely nothing to do with business, patents, or Wall Street. It was something fierce, protective, and deeply, dangerously personal. "I protect you," his eyes seemed to say, "from everyone, even your own blood." The fallout from the boardroom confrontation was swift and merciless. Victor Vance was quietly forced to resign from the Vance Pharma board to pursue other opportunities, a polite Wall Street euphemism for being exiled. But for Ellie, the victory wasn't an excuse to celebrate. It was a starting gun. With the threat of espionage neutralized, she threw herself into the genuine TGT -17 research with a manic, terrifying intensity. For 3 weeks, she practically lived in the Sterling Medical Lab. Richard watched her through the glass doors, a growing knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. The entire city of New York was asleep. But Ellie was still at the bench. She was peering through the lenses of a confocal microscope, her posture rigid, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Richard swiped his keycard and walked in. He didn't announce himself. He just walked up behind her and looked at the whiteboard. It was covered in chaotic, frantic equations, far less organized than her usual, meticulous handwriting. Ellie? She didn't flinch. She just kept staring into the microscope. "Not now, Richard. The cell cultures are showing a slight anomaly in the apoptosis rate. I need to run another flow cytometry panel to confirm." "When was the last time you slept?" Richard asked, his voice low and firm. "I slept," she muttered, adjusting the fine focus knob. "When?" "Yesterday." "Yesterday at what time?" 4 p.m. for 20 minutes, on the break room sofa. Richard's jaw clenched. She had been awake for 34 hours. He didn't argue. He simply reached over her shoulder and flipped the power switch on the microscope. The halogen bulb died, plunging the slide into darkness. "Hey!" Ellie spun around in her chair, her eyes flashing with a sudden, irrational anger born of pure exhaustion. "What the hell are you doing? I was in the middle of a count." "You are done for the night," Richard said, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Your hands are shaking, Ellie. Your data is going to be compromised if you keep pushing like this." Ellie looked down at her hands. He was right. A fine, uncontrollable tremor ran through her fingers. She stared at them for a long moment, the fight suddenly draining out of her, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes, letting out a ragged sigh. I have to get this right, Richard. If this target works, it changes everything for non-small cell lung cancer. It could increase the 5-year survival rate by 20%. Do you know how many lives that is?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Richard felt a physical ache in his chest. In his past life, he had never seen this side of her. He had never seen the brilliant, empathetic, desperate scientist who carried the weight of millions of sick people on her shoulders. He had only seen the quiet woman who drank tea in his living room. He had wasted so much time. "I know," Richard said softly. He stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking out the harsh lab lights, casting her in a gentle shadow. "But you can't save them if you kill yourself first. The cells will be here tomorrow. The incubator is secure." Ellie looked up at him. Without the barrier of her glasses, her dark eyes looked incredibly vulnerable. "I am just so close, Richard. For the first time in my life, I am doing exactly what I was meant to do. And I am terrified that if I stop, even for a second, someone is going to take it away from me. The vulnerability in her confession hit him like a physical blow. She was still traumatized by her family, by the constant threat of having her agency stripped away. Richard knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with her. It was a shocking gesture for a man who commanded thousands of employees and billions of dollars. But in this room, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a man trying to protect the woman he loved. "No one is going to take this away from you," Richard said, his voice a low, fierce vow. He reached out, his large hands gently enveloping her trembling ones. "Not Victor, not your father, not the board. I built this fortress for you, Ellie. As long as I am breathing, no one touches your work. You have my word." Ellie stared at him, her breath hitching. His hands were warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. The tremor in her fingers slowly began to subside under his touch. "Why, Richard?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why are you doing all this for me? You blew up a merger. You made an enemy of my father. You spent $50 million, and now you are kneeling on a lab floor at 2 a.m. telling me to sleep. Why?" Richard looked into her eyes. The truth burned in his throat, a heavy, agonizing weight. "Because in another life, I let you die. Because my ignorance killed the brightest star I ever knew. Because I love you." But he couldn't say that. She would think he was insane. "Because," Richard said slowly, his thumb gently brushing across her knuckles, "I finally see you, Eleanor. I see the scientist. I see the genius. And I refuse to let the world lose what you have to give." Ellie's heart did a violent, erratic flutter against her ribs. It wasn't a corporate answer. It wasn't a logical answer. It was deeply, profoundly personal. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the sterile hum of the lab fading into the background. The air between them felt suddenly thick, charged with an unspoken electricity that had nothing to do with science. Ellie swallowed hard, suddenly hyper, aware of how close he was, of the faint scent of bergamot and expensive wool coming from his suit. "Okay," she breathed softly. "I'll sleep." Richard stood up, releasing her hands slowly, as if reluctant to let go. "There's a cot in the adjoining office. Go." Ellie stood, her legs feeling a bit like jelly. She walked toward the office, but paused at the door. She looked back at him. He was standing by the workbench, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Something protective, aching, and incredibly intense. "Richard? Yes, Dr. Vance? Thank you." A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. "Good night, Ellie." 10 minutes later, Ellie was asleep on the cot, wrapped in a fleece blanket. Richard stood in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. In his past life, he had watched her sleep 100 times, but he had never felt this overwhelming surge of peace. He quietly closed the door, turning back to the lab. He walked over to her whiteboard, picked up the marker, and carefully corrected the final variable in her cascade equation. A minor mathematical error caused by her exhaustion. He capped the marker and left the lab, locking the glass doors behind him. The fortress was secure, but the war wasn't over. Because the next morning, Arthur Vance would officially file a patent dispute with the federal government, claiming that TGT-17 was intellectual property belonging to Vance Pharma. The final battle was about to begin. The legal notice arrived via courier at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was bound in heavy, textured legal paper, bearing the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office and the letterhead of Vance Pharma's elite corporate counsel. Richard sat behind his desk, his expression carved from granite, reading the document. Arthur Vance wasn't claiming that Victor's stolen data was real. He was executing a much more insidious, classic Wall Street maneuver, a patent troll's strategy. Vance Pharma was claiming that the underlying concept of the TGT -17 target had been vaguely referenced in a failed decade-old Vance patent application. Therefore, they argued, Ellie's current work lacked novelty and was merely an extension of Vance Pharma's intellectual property. It was a blatant lie. But in patent law, a lie backed by enough money could tie up a drug in litigation for years. They're trying to bleed us out. Marcus Thorne, the VP of R&D, said nervously, pacing in front of Richard's desk. If this goes to a full federal trial, the injunction alone will freeze Dr. Vance's research for at least 24 months. By the time we clear the patent, Novartis or Pfizer will have beaten us to the market. Richard tossed the legal notice onto his desk. They're not trying to beat us to the market, Marcus. Arthur Vance knows his R&D department is incompetent. He's trying to extort a licensing fee. He wants us to pay him a percentage of our future profits just to make the lawsuit go away. And what are we going to do? Marcus asked, sweating. Settle? Settle. Richard's voice dropped to a terrifying, lethal whisper. I don't pay ransoms, Marcus, and I certainly don't pay them to men who try to steal from my scientists. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Call our legal team. Tell them to prepare for an expedited hearing before the Patent Trial and Appeal Board. Tab. We are not settling. We are going to crush them. Down in the lab, Ellie was oblivious to the legal storm brewing above her. She was holding a printout of the latest in vivo mouse model data, her eyes scanning the numbers with mounting disbelief. The tumor regression rate wasn't just good, it was unprecedented. The targeted CRISPR delivery had shrunk the non-small cell lung tumors in the mice by 85% within 3 weeks, with zero off-target toxicity. My God, Ellie whispered, her hands trembling as she held the paper. It works. It actually works. The heavy glass doors hissed open. Richard walked in, his face unreadable. Richard, look at this. Ellie practically ran toward him, shoving the data report into his hands. All her usual professional reserve was gone, replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of discovery. 5% regression. The Cas12F miniaturization is holding stable in vivo. We can move to primate trials by Q3. Richard looked at the numbers. He knew exactly what this meant. In his past life, this drug had never existed. Millions of people had died because Eleanor Vance had been forced to plan charity galas instead of running these trials. He looked up from the paper, his dark eyes locking onto her radiant, exhausted face. It's brilliant, Ellie, he said softly. You're brilliant. Ellie's smile faltered slightly as she registered the tension in his jaw. She was too observant to miss it. What's wrong? You have that Wall Street look on your face. Richard let out a slow breath. He didn't want to ruin this moment for her, but he couldn't hide it. Your father filed a patent interference claim this morning. The joy instantly drained from Ellie's face, replaced by a cold, hardened shock. What? On what grounds? He's claiming TGT -17 is a derivative of a failed Vance Pharma patent from 2012. It's a stall tactic. He wants to force us into a settlement. Ellie stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides. The betrayal hit her hard, but she didn't cry. The tears she had shed for her family had dried up the day she walked out of the Vance estate in her Converse. The 2012 patent? Ellie scoffed, her voice dripping with scientific contempt. That was a broad-spectrum kinase inhibitor. It has absolutely zero structural or functional homology to a CRISPR, directed membrane receptor target. It's like claiming you invented the airplane because you once patented a kite. I know, Richard said. Our lawyers know, but the PAB judges aren't scientists. They're bureaucrats. Arthur is banking on confusing them with legal jargon to get an injunction. Ellie's eyes narrowed, a fierce, protective fire igniting within her. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was her life's work. This was the drug that could save millions. "When is the hearing?" she asked, her voice turning to steel. "Next Friday," Richard replied. "I've hired the best IP litigators in New York." "You don't have to worry about it, Ellie. Just focus on the next phase of the trials." Richard blinked, surprised by the absolute authority in her tone. "No, I'm not letting a bunch of corporate lawyers try to explain molecular biology to a panel of judges," Ellie said, walking over to her desk and grabbing her laptop. "They'll get butchered by my father's legal team." She turned back to Richard, her dark eyes blazing with a terrifying, magnificent intellect. "I am the lead inventor. I am the principal investigator. I will testify at the hearing." Richard stared at her. In the cutthroat world of corporate litigation, putting a scientist on the stand was incredibly risky. Lawyers were trained to twist words, to rattle academics, to make them look uncertain. But looking at Ellie now, standing in her white lab coat, her jaw set, her eyes burning with the conviction of a woman who had finally found her power, Richard knew she wasn't just an academic. She was a force of nature. A slow, proud smile spread across Richard's face. He had spent his entire life dominating boardrooms, but he had never seen anyone look as formidable as Dr. Eleanor Vance did in that moment. "All right, Doctor," Richard said softly, his voice vibrating with absolute faith. "Let's go to war." The hearing room at the Patent Trial and Appeal Board in Alexandria, Virginia, was an intimidating theater of federal bureaucracy. The walls were paneled in dark cherry wood, and the 3 administrative patent judges sat elevated behind a massive curved bench, looking down at the plaintiffs and defendants. On the left side of the room sat Arthur and Victor Vance, flanked by 3 of the most expensive intellectual property lawyers money could buy. They looked smug, relaxed, and entirely confident in their ability to bury the opposition in legal paperwork. On the right side sat Richard Sterling. Next to him was his lead counsel, and next to the counsel sat Dr. Eleanor Vance. She wore a sharp, tailored black blazer over a crisp white blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek bun. She didn't look like a nervous academic, and she certainly didn't look like the obedient daughter Arthur Vance expected to see. She looked like an executioner. "The board recognizes counsel for the petitioner, Vance Pharmaceuticals," the lead judge, a stern woman in her 50s, announced. Vance Pharma's lead attorney, a slick man named Harrison, stood up. For 20 minutes, he spun a masterful, confusing web of legal jargon. He threw around terms like prior art, obviousness, and derivative continuity, attempting to draw a straight line between Vance Pharma's failed 2012 patent and Ellie's groundbreaking TGT-17 target. "In conclusion, Your Honors," Harrison said smoothly, adjusting his silk tie, "Dr. Vance's current work is merely an obvious, iterative step based on the foundational research funded and patented by Vance Pharmaceuticals. Granting Sterling medical exclusive rights would be a severe misappropriation of my client's intellectual property." Arthur Vance nodded approvingly. Victor smirked. "Counsel for the patent owner, Sterling Medical. You may respond," the judge said. Richard's lawyer stood up, but before he could speak, Ellie placed a hand on his arm. "I will handle this," she whispered. The lawyer looked at Richard, panicked. Richard didn't hesitate. He gave a single, sharp nod. Ellie stood up. She didn't walk to the podium. She stood right at the defense table, projecting her voice clearly across the room. "Your Honors, I am Dr. Eleanor Vance, the lead inventor of the TGT-17 target, she began, her tone calm, authoritative, and entirely devoid of intimidation. Mr. Harrison has presented a very compelling legal argument. Unfortunately, it is scientifically illiterate. Harrison's smug smile vanished. Objection, Your Honor. I will demonstrate. Ellie cut him off. Not even looking at the lawyer, she picked up a remote and aimed it at the large projection screen behind the judges. A complex, 3D molecular model of a protein structure appeared on the screen. This, Ellie said, is the kinase inhibitor described in Vance Pharma's 2012 patent. It is a small molecule designed to bind to the ATP, binding pocket of an intracellular enzyme. She clicked the remote again. A completely different, vastly larger structure appeared beside it. And this is TGT-17. It is a transmembrane receptor protein. Vance Pharma claims my work is an obvious iterative step from their patent. To put this in terms the petitioner might understand. Ellie turned her gaze directly to her father and cousin, her eyes flashing with cold contempt. Claiming these two molecules are related is like claiming you invented the space shuttle because you once patented a bicycle tire. A ripple of suppressed laughter echoed from the gallery. The lead judge covered her mouth, her eyes glinting with sudden interest. Harrison scrambled to his feet, his face red. Your Honor, Dr. Vance is using hyperbole to obscure the fact that the genetic locus targeted. The genetic locus targeted by my CRISPR guide RNA is located on chromosome 7. Ellie fired back, her voice rising, commanding the room. The Vance patent references a gene on chromosome 11. They are not even on the same continent of the human genome. Furthermore, the Cas12F miniaturization delivery system I developed relies on a proprietary PAM sequence that does not exist in nature, let alone in Vance Pharma's decade-old, failed archives. Ellie picked up a thick binder from the table and dropped it with a heavy thud. Here is the raw sequencing data, the in vivo mouse models, and the complete crystallographic structure of TGT-17. None of this data exists in Vance Pharma's servers. Why? She looked dead at Victor Vance, who was now sweating profusely, shrinking under her gaze. Because Vance Pharma doesn't have the scientific capability to understand this target, let alone invent it. They are attempting to use the federal patent system not to protect innovation, but to extort it. The silence in the hearing room was absolute. Ellie didn't just defend her patent. She surgically dismantled Vance Pharma's entire R&D credibility in front of the federal government. She sat down, smoothing her blazer, her breathing perfectly even. Richard stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never been more turned on in his entire life. The lead judge looked down at Harrison, who was frantically whispering to Arthur Vance. Does counsel for the petitioner have a scientific rebuttal to Dr. Vance's structural and genomic analysis? The judge asked, her tone dry. Harrison stood up, swallowing hard. Your Honor, we would need time to consult with our own scientific experts. You've had 6 weeks to prepare your case, Counselor, the judge interrupted sharply. The board finds the petitioner's claim of obviousness to be entirely without scientific merit. The petition for inter partes review is denied. Sterling Medical's patent remains valid and enforceable. Bang, the gavel fell. It was over. Arthur Vance sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, realizing he had just lost the only leverage he had over the multi-billion-dollar drug. Victor looked like he was going to be sick. Ellie didn't gloat. She didn't even look at them. She simply packed her laptop into her bag, her movements precise and efficient. As they walked out of the hearing room and into the grand marble hallway of the courthouse, The adrenaline finally began to fade. Ellie stopped walking. She leaned back against the cool marble wall, closing her eyes, letting out a long, shaky exhale. Richard stopped in front of her. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a towering, silent shield against the rest of the world. Ellie opened her eyes and looked up at him. "We won," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "You won," Richard corrected softly. "You destroyed them, Ellie. It was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." Ellie let out a wet, breathless laugh. The weight of her family's expectations, the trauma of being treated like a pawn, the fear of losing her life's work, it all shattered and fell away in that marble hallway. She was free, without thinking, driven entirely by the overwhelming surge of relief, and the intense, magnetic pull of the man standing in front of her. Ellie reached out. She grabbed the lapels of Richard's Tom Ford suit, pulled him down, and kissed him. The kiss was desperate, electric, and entirely unexpected. For a fraction of a second, Richard froze, his brain short, circuiting as the soft, urgent pressure of her lips registered against his. In his past life, their rare moments of physical contact had been polite, hesitant, and suffocated by the heavy expectations of their arranged marriage. This was different. This was Ellie, brilliant, victorious, and fiercely alive, claiming him. Richard's hesitation vanished. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and kissed her back with a hunger that had been building across 2 lifetimes. He backed her gently against the cool marble wall of the courthouse, his hand sliding up to tangle in the hair at the nape of her neck. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Ellie rested her forehead against his chest, her hands still gripping his lapels. Her face was flushed, her heart hammering wildly against his. I don't know why I just did that," she whispered, sounding slightly dazed. "I am very glad you did," Richard murmured, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. He didn't want to let her go. He wanted to stand in this hallway forever. But the victory at the courthouse was only half the battle. There was a secret resting between them, a massive, invisible ghost that Richard had been carrying alone since the moment he woke up at the altar. He couldn't build a future with her on a foundation of lies. Not this time. "Ellie," Richard said softly, stepping back just enough to look into her eyes. "We need to talk. Not here, at my apartment." The seriousness in his tone made Ellie blink, the post-victory euphoria dimming slightly. She studied his face, seeing the heavy, agonizing weight behind his dark eyes. She nodded. "Okay." Richard's penthouse overlooking Central Park was vast, modern, and impeccably silent. In their past life, Ellie had spent 3 years trapped in these walls, wandering the empty rooms while Richard worked late. Walking into the living room now, Richard felt a phantom chill. He immediately walked over to the floor, to ceiling windows, and pulled the heavy drapes shut, as if trying to block out the memories. He poured 2 glasses of scotch, Macallan 25, and handed one to Ellie, who was standing awkwardly by the kitchen island. "Drink," he said gently. "You are going to need it." Ellie took a sip, the amber liquid burning a trail of warmth down her throat. "Richard, you are scaring me. What is it? Did my father file an appeal? Number Arthur is done. The patent is safe." Richard set his glass down without taking a sip. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, looking at her with a terrifying intensity. "Do you believe in second chances, Ellie?" he asked. Ellie frowned. "Second chances at what?" "At life, at rewriting fate." Richard took a deep breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his own arms. "What I am about to tell you is going to sound insane. You're a scientist. You believe in empirical data, in physics, in things you can prove. I can't prove this to you. but I need you to listen." Ellie set her glass down, her scientific curiosity fully engaged, tempered by the raw vulnerability in his voice. "I am listening. The day of our wedding," Richard began, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "When I stopped the ceremony, it wasn't because I suddenly realized it was a bad business deal, and it wasn't because I guessed you would be unhappy." He looked directly into her eyes. "It was because I had already lived it." Ellie stared at him, her brow furrowing. "Lived what?" "Our marriage." Richard's voice cracked. He couldn't stop the floodgates now. The words tore out of him, bleeding with 3 years of repressed agony. "In another timeline, another life. I didn't stop the wedding. We got married. You moved into this penthouse. You gave up your lab. You spent hours every morning doing your makeup just to look perfect for my board members. You waited up for me every night with a cup of tea, reading fashion magazines you hated." Ellie stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the edge of the marble island. "You were miserable, Ellie," Richard said, a tear finally escaping his eye, tracing a hot path down his cheek. "And I was a blind, arrogant fool who thought providing you with a black Amex and a penthouse was enough. I never asked you what you wanted. I never saw the scientist. I just saw the wife." Ellie's mind was racing. It was impossible. It violated every law of thermodynamics, of linear time. But as she looked at Richard's face, twisted in genuine, unbearable agony, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine, because the details he was describing. The tea, the makeup, the magazines. That was exactly the life her mother had trained her for. That was exactly what she had planned to do if she had gone through with the wedding. How? Ellie's voice trembled. How did it end? Richard closed his eyes, the memory of the tunnel crushing the air from his lungs. "A car crash," he whispered. "We were driving to the Hamptons. A truck lost control in a tunnel. He choked on the words, unable to say it. He opened his eyes, looking at her with absolute desperation. "You died in my arms, Ellie. Your blood was all over the Patek Philippe watch we got for our wedding." Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "And before you died," Richard continued, stepping closer to her, his voice breaking, "you didn't say you loved me, you didn't say goodbye. You looked at me and said, 'If there is a next life, I want to be a scientist again, no more arranged marriages.'" The silence in the penthouse was deafening. Ellie stared at the man standing before her, a man who had built her a $50 million lab, a man who had brought her Sichuan takeout at midnight, a man who had stood between her and her toxic family, taking all the bullets just so she could look through a microscope again. Suddenly, every inexplicable, crazy thing he had done over the past year made perfect, devastating sense. He hadn't done it out of pity. He hadn't done it for the patents. He had done it to give her back the soul he thought he had destroyed. Tears spilled over Ellie's eyelashes, tracking silently down her cheeks. "You came back," she whispered. "I woke up at the altar," Richard said, his voice raw, "and I swore to God, or whatever force sent me back, that I would tear the world apart before I let you be trapped in that cage again. I swore I would give you your laboratory, even if it meant you hated me forever." He took a step back, giving her space, his head bowed in defeat. "I am sorry, Ellie. I am so sorry for the life I gave you before. You don't have to forgive me. You have your lab now. You have your patent. You are free. If you want to walk out that door and never see me again, I won't stop you." Richard waited for the sound of her footsteps walking away. He waited for the door to close. Instead, he felt a pair of arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Ellie buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. She held on to him with a fierce, desperate strength. "You idiot," she sobbed. her voice muffled against his suit. "You absolute, brilliant idiot." Richard froze, his hands hovering over her back, afraid to touch her, afraid this was a dream. "Ellie? You didn't destroy me, Richard," she cried, looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears and an overwhelming, profound love. "The man who let me die in that car crash, that wasn't you. The Richard Sterling I know is the man who bought me Converse, the man who fought my father, the man who saw me." She reached up, framing his face with her trembling hands. "I don't care about the past life," Ellie whispered fiercely. "I am here, I am alive, and I choose you, not because of a contract, not because of an arrangement, because I love you." Richard let out a shattered breath. The massive, crushing weight he had carried since the moment he woke up at the altar finally broke. He pulled her up into his arms, kissing her with everything he had, all the grief, all the regret, and all the overwhelming, terrifying hope of a man who had finally, truly saved the love of his life. A year later, the clinical trial results for TGT-17 made the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the New York Times. The Phase 1 data was unprecedented. The CRISPR-based therapeutic had successfully halted the progression of non-small cell lung cancer in 92% of the trial cohort, with minimal toxicity. It wasn't just a drug, it was a paradigm shift in oncology. Sterling Medical's stock skyrocketed, cementing Richard Sterling as the undisputed king of the biotech finance world. Vance Pharma, meanwhile, had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Without Ellie's intellect and cut off from Sterling's capital, Arthur Vance had gambled the company's remaining assets on a series of disastrous, outdated, generic drug acquisitions. The Vance empire crumbled, a victim of its own arrogance and inability to adapt. But inside the pristine, sunlit laboratory on the 40th floor of Sterling Tower, the financial headlines didn't matter. Ellie stood at the primary workstation, her eyes glued to a fresh set of flow cytometry data. She was wearing her signature white lab coat, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and a faded pair of Converse. Dr. Vance. Ellie didn't look up from the screen. "Not now, Liam. The T-cell proliferation rate is showing a slight deviation in the second cohort. I need to run the assay. I'm not Liam." Ellie spun around. Richard was standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a bespoke Tom Ford suit. He wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. He looked relaxed, incredibly handsome, and entirely out of place in the sterile environment. "Richard," Ellie breathed, a massive smile breaking across her face. She practically jogged across the lab, throwing her arms around his neck. Richard caught her easily, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around once before setting her down. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the faint scent of sterile alcohol wipes and her subtle, natural perfume. "I thought you were in a board meeting," she said, pulling back to look at him. "I cancelled it," Richard replied, his eyes tracing the exhausted but radiant lines of her face. "You've been in here for 48 hours straight, Ellie. The FDA fast-track approval is secured. The drug is moving to Phase 2. You need to stop and breathe." I know, she sighed, leaning her forehead against his chest. I want it to be perfect. Every time I see a patient's chart from the trial, I think about how close this was to never existing." Richard's hand came up to gently stroke her hair. He knew exactly what she meant. In the timeline that only he remembered, this drug had died with her in a crumpled Aston Martin. "It exists because of you," Richard said softly. "You saved them, Ellie. But right now, I need to save you from your own work ethic. We have an appointment." Ellie frowned, looking up at him. An appointment? With who? I don't have anything on my calendar. With the city clerk. Ellie froze. The city clerk. Richard stepped back slightly and reached into his pocket. He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't pull out a velvet box containing a $3 million diamond that she would be afraid to wear in the lab. Instead, he pulled out a simple, elegant band of brushed platinum, a massive 10-carat rock that screams, "Look at my bank account." Please. A plain brushed platinum band that won't rip her latex lab gloves. Swoon. This is arguably the sexiest thing Richard does in the entire story. He's not marking his territory. He's honoring her calling. He's explicitly saying, "Your work matters just as much as my ego." Most men want a woman to shrink to fit into their world. A mature man builds a fortress so his woman can reign supreme in hers. 3 years ago, I stopped a wedding because it was a cage, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, his dark eyes locked onto hers. I promised myself I would never put another ring on your finger unless I was absolutely certain. It was a choice you were making for yourself, not for your father, not for a merger, just for you. He took her left hand, the hand that was calloused from holding pipettes, the hand that had rewritten the human genome, the hand he had once felt slip away into death. "Eleanor Vance," Richard whispered, "will you marry me?" Ellie stared at the simple platinum band. It was perfect. It wouldn't snag on her latex gloves. It wouldn't get in the way of her microscopes. It was a ring designed for a scientist. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision, but a blinding, beautiful smile broke across her face. "Yes," she choked out, laughing through her tears. "Yes, you brilliant, bossy capitalist. Yes." Richard slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled her in, kissing her with a fierce, possessive tenderness that made her head spin. "Go get your coat," Richard murmured against her lips. "Our Uber is waiting." "Wait! Right now!" Ellie gasped, pulling back. "Richard, I'm wearing Converse. I have cell culture stains on my jeans. I don't even have any makeup on." Richard looked at her. He saw the messy bun, the scuffed sneakers, the brilliant, unvarnished truth of the woman he loved. "You look exactly like the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with," he said. An hour later, they stood in front of a judge in a small, unadorned room at the New York City Marriage Bureau. There were no baccarat, crystal chandeliers. There were no archbishops, no Wall Street titans, no society photographers. There was no Arthur Vance glaring from the front row. It was just the two of them. "Do you, Richard Elias Sterling, take Eleanor Grace Vance to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the judge asked, looking up from his paperwork. Richard looked down at Ellie. He saw the ghosts of the past life finally dissolving into nothingness, replaced by the warm, solid reality of her hand in his. "I do," Richard said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "And do you, Eleanor Grace Vance, take Richard Elias Sterling to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ellie looked up at Richard. She didn't feel the icy grip of dread she had felt 3 years ago at the plaza. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. "I do," she said, her voice clear and bright. "By the power vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Richard didn't hesitate. He pulled her in, sealing the promise, closing the loop. When they walked out of the municipal building and onto the bustling streets of Lower Manhattan, the afternoon sun was shining brilliantly. Ellie held up her left hand, watching the sunlight catch the brushed platinum of her ring. She leaned her head against Richard's shoulder as they walked toward their waiting car. "So," Ellie said, a playful lilt in her voice, "what does the great Richard Sterling have planned for our honeymoon Paris, the Maldives?" Richard opened the car door for her. a slow, wicked smile spreading across his face. "Actually," Richard said, "I was thinking we could go back to the lab. I hear the T-cell proliferation assay needs checking." Ellie stopped, staring at him in mock outrage. Before bursting into laughter, she grabbed his tie and pulled him in for one last, lingering kiss before sliding into the car. "You," she whispered, "are the perfect husband." As the car pulled away, merging into the endless flow of New York City traffic. Richard looked at his wife. She was already pulling out her tablet, reviewing her data, the platinum ring gleaming softly on her finger. The timeline had been rewritten, the cage had been broken, and Dr. Eleanor Vance was finally exactly where she belonged. Let's get real for a second, babes. How many of us have played the perfect partner? We tone down our smarts. We hide our spicy takeout habits. We wear the uncomfortable stilettos, all to fit into a mold that society or a man designed for us. We think we're building a marriage, but we're actually just digging our own graves, one tiny compromise at a time. What fascinates me about Richard isn't that he's some billionaire Prince Charming. Let's be honest, those don't exist outside of Wall Street fairy tales. What makes him compelling is that he had the brutal, devastating self-awareness to realize he was the villain in her first life. His ignorance was the weapon that killed her. He didn't come back and try to woo her into the same penthouse with softer pillows. He gave her an empire. He gave her back her fangs. He realized that a husband isn't supposed to be a woman's entire future. He's supposed to be the guy holding the door open while she conquers it. This story hits hard because it's not really about time travel or corporate espionage. It's about the ultimate aphrodisiac being truly, completely seen. Not for your family pedigree, not for your pretty face, but for the messy, obsessive, brilliant core of who you are. So, my beautiful observers, I want to turn it over to you. Have you ever shrunk yourself to fit into someone else's picture, perfect life? Or, hopefully, have you found a partner who buys you the metaphorical plain platinum ring so you can keep doing your own badass work? Drop your stories in the comments below. Let's spill some tea, shed a little baggage, and remind each other that we belong in the laboratory of life, not on a display shelf. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story. Stay ruthless, darlings.